How could one of the most mass-produced tanks of World War II, an icon of American industrial might, be brought to a grinding halt by just 5 deadly errors, repeated again and again, across only 2 miles of battlefield? To understand this, we travel back to July 11, 1944, in the shattered farmlands south of St. Lo, Normandy. The air hangs heavy with dust and cordite as elements of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, Task Force X, push forward toward German defensive belts held by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The hedgerows, the infamous bocage, turn every field into a fortress, every lane into a kill zone, every advance into a gamble of steel and fire. By dawn, American armor begins its push. Columns of M4A1 and M4A3 Shermans, their Continental engines growling, move cautiously along narrow lanes flanked by earthen walls. Infantry from the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment walk alongside, scanning for Panzerfaust teams, machine gun nests and telltale shadows behind the hedges. But within just 2 miles, disaster strikes, again and again. 5 critical mistakes, some mechanical, some tactical, some tragically human, combine to turn this advance into a nightmare. What unfolds over the next hour would be studied for decades, used as training doctrine and remembered by the survivors as one of the most punishing stretches of ground they ever crossed. Little did they know, every one of those mistakes was waiting for them just ahead. By mid-July 1944, the Allied advance in Normandy had slowed to a brutal crawl. Although the beaches were secure, the real battle, the deadly, grinding push through the bocage, had only just begun. The bocage was unlike anything American armored units had trained for. Each field was surrounded by an ancient hedgerow, an earthen embankment topped with centuries-old roots, thorn bushes and dense vegetation. Many were 4 to 8 feet high, with embankments thick enough to stop bullets and roots strong enough to trap tank tracks. 4 German defenders, each field was a potential strongpoint. 4 Allied armor, each one was a coffin waiting to be sealed. On July 11, 1944, Combat Command A of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division prepared for what commanders believed would be a sharp, decisive push south toward the vital crossroads at Heber-Kreven, just outside St. Lo. The American belief was that German resistance was thinning after weeks of aerial bombardment and artillery barrages. They were wrong. Very wrong. Across their front lay hardened veterans of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, supported by elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Gotz von Berlichingen. These units had perfected the art of defensive warfare in the bocage. They knew the angles, the kill zones, the blind spots. They dug spider holes into the hedgerows, camouflaged MG-42 teams, and concealed Panzerfaust squads who could strike and vanish like ghosts. Anti-tank guns, most notably the dreaded 7.5 cm PaK-40, were positioned behind hedges with pre-sighted ranges. Each gun had overlapping fields of fire, turning every lane into a potential death trap. The Shermans of the 32nd Armored Regiment moved out first that morning. Most were M4A1s, powered by Continental R975 radial engines, mounting the standard 75mm M3 cannon. They were supported by armored infantry from the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment, engineers from the 23rd Engineer Battalion, and artillery batteries positioned several kilometers behind them. But even with this combined armed strength, the terrain favored defense, not attack. The Americans had intelligence reports suggesting enemy armor was nearby, possibly elements of the SS Panzer Regiment II, including Panzer IVs and even the feared Panther OSV. But no one knew their exact positions. The hedgerows made reconnaissance almost useless. Even aerial observation struggled. From above, the terrain looked like a patchwork quilt of small squares, harmless, almost pastoral. On the ground, each square hid danger. As the column prepared to advance, tank commanders reviewed their orders. The objective was clear: break through 2 miles of dense bocage, seize a critical east-west road, and create an opening for the division's broader attack towards St. Lo. But what none of them realized was that this short stretch of land would become one of the most unforgiving battlefields they would ever face. The tension among the crews was palpable. Many of the tankers were on their first real combat push. Some had seen action in the previous weeks, encountering the shock of German anti-tank tactics for the first time. They knew the Sherman's strengths, its reliability, mobility, and fast turret traverse. But they also knew its weaknesses: a tall silhouette, thinner frontal armor than German heavy tanks, and ammunition that could ignite catastrophically if the hull was penetrated. Inside the tight, cramped hulls, men checked their gear one last time. The loaders stacked 75mm shells within reach, armor-piercing, high-explosive, and smoke. The gunners calibrated their sights, knowing they might have only seconds to identify and fire upon an enemy gun hidden deep in a hedgerow shadow. Drivers wiped sweat from their palms even in the morning coolness. Their job required precision, courage, and calm in moments when panic could be fatal. Infantrymen marched alongside the tanks, rifles raised, eyes searching every shadow. The armored infantry knew that tanks alone could not survive in the bocage. Every hedge concealed places for ambush. The infantry had to clear them step by step, meter by meter, while the tanks provided covering fire and brute force. By 0700 hours the column began its movement. Dust rose as tank treads bit into the dry soil. The first hedgerow appeared like a silent wall ahead, just one of dozens they would have to breach. Engineers moved forward with explosive charges and cutting tools. Each delay increased the danger. The Germans were listening, watching, waiting. The Americans believed they had momentum, firepower, and numbers. Yet lurking behind the next hedge, and the next, were defenses perfectly designed to exploit the 5 fatal mistakes that would soon bring the Shermans to a standstill over just 2 brutal miles of Normandy countryside. Little did they know, the cost of those mistakes would be measured in fire, steel, and lives. By 0930 hours the American column had advanced less than 300 yards. The first hedgerow breach cleared by engineers exposed a narrow lane, flanked on both sides by towering walls of green. The Shermans pushed through cautiously, their engines growling under the strain. The infantry followed close behind, rifles raised, nerves stretched tight. The only sound was the low rumble of tank treads and the distant thump of German mortars somewhere ahead. The Americans didn't know it yet, but they had already committed the first of 5 brutal mistakes, advancing down a predictable route the Germans had pre-sighted for days. By 1000 hours, the column entered a small bowl-shaped field surrounded by hedgerows. Tank commanders scanned the perimeter with their periscopes, uneasy. A field like this, too quiet, too still, was exactly the type the Germans loved to turn into a killing ground. Hidden just 250 yards ahead, beneath a carefully trimmed gap in the hedgerow, a 7.5 centimeters PaK-40 anti-tank gun of the 2nd SS Panzer Division lay in wait. Its crew had rehearsed their fire mission repeatedly. Their target? The first Sherman to appear in the open. But the Americans had no way of seeing it. The gun was embedded into the bank, barrel tucked into dark shadow, camouflaged with branches. At 1007 hours, the lead Sherman of the 32nd Armored Regiment eased forward. The commander, First Lieutenant Robert Milan, lifted his head out of the cupola for a clearer view. He never saw the flash. A deafening crack split the air. A jet of flame burst from the hedgerow. The 75mm shell punched through the Sherman's glassy plate. The tank erupted in smoke. Its engine stalled. Flames licked from the driver's hatch. Anti-tank gun. Front! Someone shouted. Infantry dove for the ground. Another round slammed into the disabled Sherman. The crew scrambled out, one man engulfed in fire. Medics rushed forward as the tank burned. The Shermans pulled back behind the hedgerow. But now the lane was blocked, and the enemy had revealed only a fraction of their defenses. Mistake 2 was about to unfold. By 10:45 hours, the Americans attempted to flank the enemy gun through an adjacent lane, with only tanks, no infantry clearing ahead. A fatal oversight. The German defenders of Das Reich had placed MG-42 nests in overlapping arcs behind the next hedgerow. As the second Sherman nosed forward, muzzle flashes erupted from 3 directions. Bullets ricocheted off armor. Troops hit the dirt. The tank commander slammed the turret around to engage, but the Germans were already repositioning deeper into the hedge shadows. Just 60 yards to the left, hidden in a sunken trail, a Panzerfaust team waited. The moment the Sherman exposed its side armor, boom. The warhead struck just behind the turret ring. The tank shook violently, tracks snapping, the right side erupting in sparks and flame. Inside, men screamed for help. Infantry struggled to return fire, but the angles were impossible. Every movement brought a new burst of MG-42 fire. The Germans controlled the entire field. By 11:20 hours, 2 Shermans were already knocked out, with 5 wounded and 2 dead. Yet the column had advanced barely half a mile. The third mistake came next, and it came from the sky. At 1145 hours, American artillery attempted to support the advance. But with no clear sight lines and radio confusion inside the dense bocage, the fire landed short. Shells erupted dangerously close to the American line. Infantry hit the ground as shrapnel slashed through branches. Fog and dust clouded everything. The Germans took advantage immediately. At 1200 hours, they launched a coordinated counter-ambush. Mortars from the SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 4 rained down heavy fire. The thump whistle crash rhythm echoed across the fields. Several infantrymen were struck, screaming as medics tried to drag them to cover. Shermans attempted to provide suppressive fire, blasting high explosive rounds into the hedges, but the thick vegetation absorbed much of the blast. Dirt and leaves flew, but the defenders held firm. By 12:30 hours, German reinforcements arrived. A platoon of Panzer IV Ausf. Tanks moved into position behind a distant hedgerow. Their long-barrel 75mm KWK-40 cannons gave them lethal reach. The Americans still had no idea they were there. At 1305 hours, the 4th Sherman in line crept around a bend, only to be met with a thunderous impact that tore through its front armor. A second shell followed instantly. The Sherman erupted in flames, the turret hatch blasting open as smoke poured skyward. Tank crews froze. Infantry dropped behind what little cover they had. The German Panzer IVs had found their range. By 1400 hours, the column had advanced barely 1 mile, at the cost of 3 Shermans destroyed, 1 damaged and over a dozen casualties. The Germans were tightening the noose field by field, hedge by hedge. And deeper within the maze of bocage, an even greater threat waited to deliver the next blow. Little did the Americans know. Mistake 4, the deadliest of all, was closing in on them. By 1400 hours, the battlefield had descended into chaos. Smoke drifted lazily above the hedgerows, hanging in the humid July air like a shroud. The cries of the wounded mingled with the thundering roar of distant artillery. The Shermans of the 32nd Armored Regiment were now deep inside a natural maze, and the walls were closing in on them. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward 2-mile advance was unraveling into a nightmare. They had reached the midpoint of their route, and were now trapped by the consequences of their own mistakes. Mistake 4 was unfolding rapidly, and brutally. The narrow lane the Shermans occupied forked ahead into 2 hedgerow-lined paths. Believing the right side looked less overgrown, the tank platoon leader, Lieutenant Milan, ordered his remaining Shermans to take that route. But the Germans had predicted this. Just beyond the bend, concealed beneath netting and branches, lay a Panther Ausf. From SS Panzer Regiment 2, its long 75mm KWK-42 cannon already trained on the lane. The Panther had been listening to the fight for hours. The crew knew exactly when to strike. At 20:45, as the next Sherman exposed even a fraction of its hull around the bend, the Panther fired. A blinding flash. A thunderous boom. The shell ripped through the Sherman from front to back, igniting ammunition and blasting the turret partially off its ring. Flames poured out of every hatch. The tank became a furnace in less than 10 seconds. Panther! Panther front! Someone screamed over the comms, but the German tank was already reversing, disappearing behind the hedge that had hidden it so perfectly. The Americans fired blindly into the vegetation, but the Panther had already repositioned, vanishing like a phantom. The remaining Shermans lurched backward, desperate to escape the kill zone. But reversing in a hedgerow lane was slow, too slow. The tanks scraped against the earthen walls, their engines straining. The Germans saw their chance. At 21:30, Panzerfaust teams surged forward along trench lines cut into the hedgerows in advance. They fired from just 40 yards away, their warheads slamming into the thin side armor of the Shermans. Another tank burst into flames. The driver died instantly. 2 crewmen managed to crawl out, one engulfed in fire. American infantry tried desperately to hold the hedges, but MG-42s opened up from 3 different angles. Mortar rounds detonated overhead, raining metal fragments through the leaves. The column was coming apart. By 1500 hours, radio reports confirmed the worst. German units were maneuvering behind the American line. The 3rd Armored's left flank had collapsed under sustained mortar fire and sniper attacks. The Shermans in the lead were now effectively encircled. The men realized with horror that they were trapped inside a pocket barely 400 yards wide. Lieutenant Milan's replacement, Sergeant Walter Briggs, surveyed the scene from his hatch. He could hardly believe it. 3 lanes were cut off by anti-tank guns. Panzerfaust teams controlled the hedges. A Panther roamed somewhere ahead. And mortar fire was tightening the circle. They had one option left: push forward or die where they stood. But the Germans were ready for that too. At 1515 hours, the Germans initiated the final phase of their trap. A second Pak-40 opened fire from a position that had remained silent all day. Its shells tore through the lanes, striking the earth banks and showering tank crews with dirt and splinters. The Shermans couldn't see the gun. They couldn't maneuver. And they couldn't retreat. One shell ripped through the turret of another Sherman, killing the commander instantly. The gunner, blinded by smoke and debris, fired wildly at the hedgerow, but hit nothing. Infantry tried to storm the hedges, but MG-42 crossfire shredded their formations. Men dove into ditches, crawling through mud, praying for the firing to stop. Mistake 4 had fully matured. They had advanced without securing their flanks, and now the Germans controlled every inch of the terrain around. EM.BY 1600 hours, the situation was hopeless. Smoke from burning tanks mixed with the humid July air, choking the survivors. The ground shook as the Panther returned, firing again from a different angle. Its shell slammed into the last Sherman capable of moving forward, blowing off its right track and pinning it in the lane. Now the Americans had zero armored mobility, zero momentum, zero escape routes. Inside the remaining Shermans, crews huddled low as shells hammered the lane. Some men prayed. Others sat in stunned silence, waiting for the inevitable. Infantry casualties mounted by the minute. Medics couldn't reach the wounded. Engineers had been split from the main column. Radio communication was breaking down. This was no longer a battle. It was a hunt. And the Americans were the prey. A final blow seemed imminent. At 1625 hours, mortar fire intensified. Shell after shell rained down. Branches snapped. Dirt flew. Shrapnel carved through the lanes like scythes. The last Sherman with a working gun, Sergeant Briggs' tank, was hit by debris and partially buried as a mortar shell detonated yards away. The blast stunned the crew. Briggs struggled to breathe, choking on dust as his driver pulled the hatch shut. Outside, infantry huddled behind the disabled armor, using it as their only shield. Whispers spread through the line. "We're done. No way out. They've got us boxed in." By 1645 hours, even the officers believed the same. No reinforcements. No artillery support, they could not risk friendly fire again. No way to break the encirclement. Just 2 miles into the advance, the entire force teetered on the edge of annihilation. The Germans tightened their perimeter. Panzer IVs moved in from the southeast. The Panthers circled for a finishing shot. This was the absolute breaking point. This was where men expected to die. Little did they know. The turning point was coming. From a direction no one expected. Just when the Americans believed the fight was lost, salvation began with a single decision, made not by a ranking officer, but by a sergeant who refused to die in a hedgerow grave. Sergeant Walter Briggs, commander of the last Sherman with a functioning main gun, forced himself upright despite the dizziness still ringing in his ears from the previous blast. Smoke seeped into the turret. The tank was half buried in dirt, its right track damaged, its engine coughing. But the gun still worked, barely. Briggs knew what everyone else did not want to say out loud. If they stayed in that lane, they were dead. If they tried to retreat, they were dead. If they waited for reinforcements, they were dead. They needed something radical. Something reckless. Something the Germans would not expect. And then, as another mortar shell detonated nearby, spraying the tank with more debris, Briggs noticed something, a depression in the hedgerow behind them. It wasn't much. Just a dip in the earth wall that looked thinner than the rest of the hedge. But to Briggs it was a door. He yelled to his crew. "We're making our own way out. Back through the hedge." The driver hesitated. "We'll get stuck, Sarge." But Briggs cut him off. "Better stuck than dead. Punch it." The driver revved the engine. The Sherman lurched backward. The track spun in the dirt. The hull slammed into the hedgerow. For a moment it seemed hopeless. The tank shuddered violently, vines and branches scraping across its armor like claws. And then, with a final surge, the Sherman tore through the hedge. They had broken out of the lane. The infantry gasped as they watched the tank erupt through the wall of green like a beast bursting from a cage. Briggs immediately radioed what remained of the company. "Follow the gap. Get off the road. We're moving through the fields." This was not standard doctrine. Not even close. Shermans were not meant to maneuver cross-country in dense bocage. They could easily tip, get stuck, or expose their belly armor. But Briggs understood something deeper. Germans expected Americans to stay in the lanes. They had prepared every meter of those lanes. Every angle. Every trap. They had not prepared for a Sherman to suddenly appear inside a field they thought was secure. The infantry followed, scrambling through the hole Briggs had made. Other Sherman crews, inspired by the unexpected breakout, fired their engines and attempted the same maneuver. The second tank made it through. The third became lodged, but infantry used it as cover, climbing over its hull to join the breakaway. The Germans noticed immediately. Machine gun fire shifted. Mortars adjusted. But it was too late. The Americans were no longer in the kill zone the Germans controlled. They were now in the Germans' flank. Inside the field, Briggs spotted movement, Panzer Grenadiers sprinting toward a new firing position. He swung the turret. Load he. The loader slammed a high-explosive shell into the breach. Boom. The shell detonated against the hedgerow, shredding branches and sending shockwaves through the trench line. German soldiers scattered. Infantry poured forward, using the chaos to their advantage. They overran an MG-42 nest, silencing it with a hail of rifle and bar fire. Engineers finally rejoined the line, dragging satchel charges forward. Briggs' breakthrough was becoming a ripple. That ripple was becoming a wave. And the wave was about to turn into the counterstroke that would save the entire force. On the far side of the field, concealed behind yet another hedgerow, sat the Panther, the same tank that had torn through the American line earlier. Its commander, SS Untersturmführer Karl Drexler, was preparing for a final kill shot down the lane where he believed the Americans still cowered. He had no idea a Sherman was maneuvering behind him. Briggs spotted the Panther first, its turret facing the wrong direction. He felt a surge of adrenaline. AP round, now. The loader jammed an armor-piercing shell into the breach. The gunner steadied his breath. The Panther began to traverse, sensing danger too late. Briggs shouted, "Fire!" The Sherman recoiled violently as the AP round screamed across the field and slammed into the Panther's side armor, one of the few places a Sherman could reliably penetrate. Flames burst from the German tank's engine compartment. The Panther spun violently, shuddered, and fell still. A cheer rose from the American infantry. For the first time all day, hope ignited. But the turning point was not just one kill. The destruction of the Panther collapsed the coordination of the German ambush. Without its long gun dominating the lanes, the PaK-40 crews lost their covering fire. Panzerfaust teams were suddenly exposed in open fields they had never meant to fight in. And with American infantry now attacking from unexpected angles, German machine gun positions began falling one by one. Engineers cleared a new route through the hedgerow, using explosives to widen the breach. Tanks that had been trapped for hours finally found escape. Medics rushed the wounded through the newly opened corridor. The Germans realized the Americans were no longer prey. They were breaking out. Worse, they were counterattacking. A surviving Sherman pushed through the gap to join Briggs' tank. Together, they began methodically blasting German strongpoints. High-explosive shells cratered the hedges. Coaxial machine guns raked trenches. Infantry threw grenades into dugouts and rooted out the last defenders. By late afternoon, the American force had punched through the German line, linked up with reinforcements from the 23rd Engineer Battalion, and opened a corridor back to friendly territory. The encirclement was broken. Fire superiority had shifted. The German trap had been shattered. Against all odds, through a single desperate decision, the tide had turned. And the Shermans, battered and burning though they were, had survived the two most brutal miles they would ever face. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke drifted away into the humid Normandy evening, the battlefield revealed the full cost of the fight. The Americans held the ground, not because the advance had gone smoothly, but because they had refused to allow a massacre to become a rout. The breakout, born from desperation and raw instinct, had saved the remnants of the column. But the 2 miles they had crossed were littered with reminders of how close disaster had come. Across the hedgerows, 6 Shermans lay burned out, their blackened hulls still warm from the infernos that consumed them. 3 more were damaged beyond field repair and later written off. Crews from 4 of those tanks never escaped. Some were killed instantly by armor-piercing shells that tore through steel as if it were paper. Others died in flames before they could be pulled clear. Infantry losses were severe. The 36th Armored Infantry Regiment recorded over 40 casualties during those grim hours, killed, wounded, or missing. Medics worked through the night, bandaging shattered limbs, treating shrapnel wounds, and comforting men who trembled uncontrollably from shock. Yet, despite everything, the column had not been destroyed. And that alone was extraordinary. The Germans had inflicted brutal damage, destroyed tanks, broken formations, and pinned an entire spearhead under relentless fire. But their meticulously prepared trap had collapsed the moment American forces burst through the hedgerow and shattered the coordination of the Panther-led ambush. What remained of SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 4 withdrew towards St. Lo under cover of darkness, carrying their wounded with them. The destroyed Panther, still smoldering in the field where Sergeant Briggs Sherman struck it, became a powerful symbol to the Americans. It proved that even in the worst conditions, outflanked, outgunned, outmaneuvered, courage and adaptation could overcome even the most formidable machine Germany produced. In the hours that followed, engineers widened the breakout route, allowing reinforcements and supply vehicles to reach the battered front line. Mechanic crews worked tirelessly to recover damaged Shermans, towing them to rear positions for stripping and salvage. Commanders filed their first after-action reports, noting in stark language the unanticipated density of enemy defenses and the critical necessity of nonlinear maneuver through hedgerow obstacles. Those reports would later guide tactical doctrine that shaped the rest of the Normandy campaign. For Sergeant Walter Briggs, the consequences of his decision echoed far beyond the battlefield. His daring maneuver, forcing a Sherman backward through a hedgerow to escape the kill zone, was officially documented as the turning point of the engagement. A recommendation for the Silver Star was submitted within days, citing exceptional courage, decisive leadership, and extraordinary presence of mind under concentrated enemy fire. His loader and gunner were later awarded the Bronze Star for their roles in destroying the Panther tank that threatened to annihilate the entire column. Several infantrymen who charged MG-42 nests during the breakout received combat infantryman badges and were mentioned in divisional after-action commendations. But medals and commendations only tell part of the story. The deeper legacy of those 2 brutal miles lies in what the U.S. Army learned from them. The catastrophe, and the desperate recovery, forced armored commanders to rethink nearly every assumption about tank warfare in Normandy. From this battle and many like it, new tactics emerged. Combined arms hedgerow teams, where tanks, infantry and engineers moved as a single unit. Hedgerow cutters, welded onto Sherman hulls, allowing tanks to burst through obstacles without exposing their underbellies. Flanking doctrine, emphasizing unpredictable movement to avoid pre-sighted kill zones. Improved coordination with artillery to prevent deadly friendly fire miscalculations. The battle also contributed to the growing recognition of the Sherman's vulnerabilities, its high silhouette, thinner armor and ammunition storage that too easily ignited. These flaws had cost lives. Commanders demanded improvements, leading to better armor kits, wet ammunition storage and tactical adjustments that saved crews in later battles. For the men who survived those 2 miles, the experience never left them. They spoke of the heat, the choking dust, the deafening explosions that shook the air like thunder. They remembered the screams of wounded comrades, the sudden flash of anti-tank guns firing from hidden lairs, and the crushing realization that the Germans had seemed to know every step the Americans would take. But they also remembered the moment that changed everything, the sudden roar of Briggs' Sherman as it tore through the hedgerow, defying every expectation and shattering the encirclement that should have destroyed them. In the larger arc of the war, this engagement became a small but vital chapter in the eventual breakout from Normandy. Every hedgerow conquered, every ambush survived, every mile gained, no matter how costly, brought the Allies closer to the gates of Saint-Lô, and eventually Paris. And for historians, this battle stands as one of the clearest examples of why the Normandy campaign was so punishing. It illustrated with chilling precision how a modern, mechanized force could be brought to the brink of annihilation by terrain, preparation, and tactical missteps, yet also how innovation and human courage could reverse even the darkest moment. Those 2 miles taught the U.S. Army more than months of training ever had. And they reminded the world that wars are not won only by machines, firepower, or planning, but by the men who refuse to break when everything around them is burning. The survivors carried that lesson for the rest of their lives. A scar, a memory, and a quiet pride born from the day they fought their way out of a trap that should have ended them all. As the dust settled and the battlefield fell silent, the men who survived would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. Their courage, their fear, their sacrifice, etched into history even when their names were not. Battles end, but the echoes of what happened linger on in the soil, the wrecks, and the memories of those who stood their ground when everything seemed lost. And as we close this chapter, remember that this was just one story among thousands. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Dark Tales as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.